One of my favorite gospels in the entire canonical tradition is today's gospel, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 28, and I love it because it's foundational. It clearly identifies the mission of the Holy Catholic Church. The mission of the Church is to make disciples of all nations, making other Christ in this world, beginning with oneself. Now that said, I think whenever we hear that, the call to discipleship, the call to evangelization, however you want to frame it, we tend to be somewhat reductive. We tend to reduce a thing to what we might call virtue signaling. And virtue signaling is simply naming an obvious truth which everyone knows to be true. Naming an obvious truth which everyone knows to be true. Or in particular, when it comes to the Catholic thing, articulating what the Church believes with regards to a particular issue, even though everyone already knows. So I'll give an example. Back in the day when I was in a previous parish setting, there was a retired priest who was given a homily. I was the concelebrant. And as he was giving a homily, I was thinking to myself, this seems to be a recycled homily, like a homily I'd given multiple times before in the past. And more to the point, at the very end, he simply named the Church's position with regards to not just one, but three hot topic issues in rapid succession, 1, 2, and 3, in a very aggressive and forceful way, without further discussion or explanation. And I remember at the end, people were applauding him for being really brave and courageous, but in response, I was thinking to myself, there's something to be said about being clear. It's very important to be clear about what the Church teaches about this, that, and the other thing. But at the same time, you can't reduce evangelization simply to being loud or angry or argumentative. The goal is not to win the argument. The goal is to win the person. The goal is not to win the argument. The goal is to win the person. And that requires good process. So with that in mind, I want to give you some practical tips in terms of how to advance the cause, in terms of discipleship building and evangelization, with this particular goal in mind, winning the person as opposed to winning the argument. So the first thing that comes to mind is this notion of openness. So in this particular moment, is the person in question that you're speaking with actually open to having a meaningful conversation? No small thing. And the focal point is this moment. Next moment, that's a story and a problem for a different day, but in terms of this particular moment, is the person in question open to having a meaningful discussion about anything? To illustrate the point, think about the gospel. So over the course of the Passion narrative, Jesus Christ obviously talks to many people. So think about how he talks to King Herod. So Jesus Christ, he's bound, he's before King Herod, and King Herod is asking him all sorts of questions, in response to which Jesus says what? Nothing. Jesus Christ says nothing. He's simply a source of amusement and entertainment, which demonstrates a certain fundamental lack of openness to meaningful conversation, as a result of which Jesus Christ says nothing, even though King Herod is asking him a whole bunch of questions. Hold that thought and think about Pontius Pilate. So is Pontius Pilate rude? Is he condescending? Is he struggling with all sorts of things, shame and fear and even his own conscience? Absolutely. At the same time, Jesus Christ has a lively back and forth dialogue with him about all sorts of things. And why? Because he demonstrates a certain baseline openness to discussion. Even if something as basic as I ask a question and I'm open to the answer. Even if it's something as basic and simple as I ask a question and I'm actually open to the answer. And the Lord takes that, he recognizes it, he runs with it. So they talk about a whole variety of things. Kingdom of God, who he is in terms of salvation history, and the nature of truth. Second thing that comes to mind, barriers to communication. So back in the day, a priest friend of mine and I, we were invited to dinner at some family's place. And in retrospect, the invitation was meant to kind of help these kids convert over dinner, which was annoying. So my priest friend, he was taking everything at face value. So based on what you say, clearly these are the things that are important, these are the things that we should talk about. As a result of which, they're talking about the Crusades and various points of doctrine. But for my part, I was thinking, no. I think I barely said anything at that dinner. Because I knew that it had nothing to do with the Crusades. It had nothing to do with these things that they were talking about. I had had private conversations with these kids before in the past, and I knew they had been bullied terribly before, multiple times in grade school. As a result of which, they found safety and comfort, not in God, not in their parents, but in gangs. Strength in numbers, sort of a pack mentality. And so given all that, what's the barrier to communication? I'm afraid of being hurt again. And forgive me if I'm reluctant to put my trust in something which seems weak and flimsy and fake, something akin to like the tooth fairy. That was the issue as opposed to the Crusades. And if you don't identify that, if you don't flag the issue appropriately, you could be spending hours talking about the Crusades or various points of doctrine, but in a certain sense, you're wasting your breath. So barriers to communication. One final thing, it's very important to kind of wait for the opportunity and then rise to the occasion. So I'm a huge hockey fan, but I'm from Vancouver. So I'm a Vancouver Canucks fan. And for the longest time, the Vancouver Canucks, their best players were Daniel and Henrik Sedin. But for the longest time, they were good players, but they weren't great players. And that changed when they signed a particular free agent, Mats Sundin from the Toronto Maple Leafs. I know. Even though Mats Sundin was there for a single year, after that, they became superstar players. And then later on, the reporters from Vancouver, they were asking him, like, what did you learn? What did you learn from Mats Sundin? And in response, what they said, basically, just to paraphrase, was, we learned from him not to chase the game. Say, for example, when we were playing a game and things weren't going our way in like the first period, we would panic, we would deviate from our structure, we would doubt ourselves, we would doubt the team. More often than not, we would lose, and that particular mindset would actually interfere with our own personal development as players. But then Mats Sundin came and we watched him, and he didn't chase the game. He let the game come to him. He knew an opportunity would arise. And when the opportunity arose, he would recognize the opportunity and be able to rise to the occasion. So again, don't chase the game, let the game come to you. I want to end now with a concrete example just to kind of flesh that out. So back in the day when I was in law school, I had a classmate, a friend of mine, who knew I was pretty good at talking to people, I guess. And so she wanted me to talk to her nephew who was struggling with something that she couldn't really identify. I think the plan in retrospect was that we would go out for dinner. I would meet this guy I'd never met before in my life and say, hey, what's your issue? Let's talk about it. But we didn't do that, right? So we went out to this restaurant, appetizer, entree, dessert, nothing. And then we went to the after party. So we went to her place, and obviously he came along. 1 hour passed by, 2 hours, 3 hours. The whole time I'm bringing up like nothing. We're just making small talk. At the end of the 3 hours, finally, he starts talking. He started talking about his fears and his shame, his weaknesses, his apprehensions, his issues, and his hopes and his dreams, the whole 9 yards, right? And we had this really wonderful discussion in terms of how to move forward in light of his particular situation. But here's the thing. We needed all that time. We needed all that time. Even at the end of the 3-hour after party, if he wasn't ready to talk, I wasn't going to force the issue. We would meet again. It's very important to recognize that. That particular approach to process can be infuriating at times because it requires patience, but it is necessary. You got to realize, again, the goal is not to win the argument, the goal is to win the person. And the way you typically win the person is little by little, bit by bit. That is the way that you advance the mission of the church and make inroads to make disciples of all nations.